Welcome to Sustainable Vegetable and Herb Production lecture on post-harvest handling and safety practices. Why are good post-harvest handling practices important? One of the main reasons many people think about when they hear that question is food safety and reducing the spread of disease and illness. Post-harvest handling is important so that you assure you get high-quality, disease-free produce with a good shelf life. Proper handling during harvest and appropriate post-harvest handling and storage is very important to achieve those results. You can go out to the ATRA website at atra.ncat.org and they have additional information on post-harvest handling. Maintaining quality is also important. You want to make sure that your product, when it reaches the market or reaches your customer, has good appearance, has good texture, flavor, as well as high nutritive value. You want to protect food safety during post-harvest handling, and to do that you need things such as good sanitation practices. You want to avoid introducing any additional pathogens into your product, and you want to keep it from spoiling. This will help you reduce losses of your product by the time it reaches your customer. You will have to throw less away. And you can do these safety practices in ways that help to improve your efficiency and profitability. Post-harvest handling actually begins the moment the product is harvested, and it's important that all product being harvested is not handled roughly. And to do that, you need to train your workers or yourself on how to handle produce when they're picking it. Having a bucket 2 rows over when you pick your tomatoes and trying to make the long shot is not a good way to pick tomatoes. You want to use appropriate containers. Containers can range in size as be round or square. They can have be deeper or shallower depending on what product you're handling, and it's important that you pick a container that's appropriate for your product. For example, if you're picking apples, you can put those into a larger container than if you're picking tomatoes. In this bottom picture here you see what is called a bulb crate, and the tomatoes are sitting in there several layers deep. That is inappropriate, actually. Tomatoes in bulb crates, the bottom row of tomatoes actually gets the weight of the tomatoes on top, push it against the bulb crate, and you can actually get splitting and cracking of your tomatoes, as well as the tomatoes having that design impressed in them from the bulb crate plastic. You want to avoid harvesting in excessive heat. You also want to keep the produce cool while it's waiting transport back to the packing shed. And one of the ways you can do that, if you don't have a refrigerated trailer or a refrigerated container that you're going to put them in, is to actually pack them in their containers and then set them in the shade. Another way to make sure that produce is kept cool and avoid heat when you're harvesting is to pick early in the morning. There are several different packing methods that can be used once you're harvesting or as you're harvesting. One packing method is basically not having any. You would just put them, as you're picking them, into a large container, and then the produce would not be individually packed. You can field pack, meaning as you're picking your crop, it is actually being placed into its final packaging that it will be sold in. An example of this is strawberries and peaches. Celery, lettuces are also packed into their final packaging. This helps reduce the handling, which in turn reduces the possibility of contamination, as well as reduce your labor costs. For other vegetables, you would bring them back to a packing shed or a packing station, and those can have a roof. Most typically they all have roofs, but they may or may not have sides. And there's typically a packing line, so they start at one end and they go through this line until they are finally placed in their package at the end. And then they're removed from the packing line into a cold storage area and sometimes directly to a loading dock. Cold storage is extremely important if you're going to hold your vegetables for any length of time, and it's important because it helps maintain the quality of that produce. It will help remove field heat. As I said, field heat's important to remove for the quality of the produce. If field heat is not removed, that vegetable or that product can continue to ripen, and then the quality goes down. It helps by lowering respiration, and that will reduce the water loss out of your product. It will also decrease the sensitivity to ethylene, and ethylene is a gas that causes ripening in many products. It will also reduce the production of ethylene. This will also inhibit growth of decay-causing microorganisms. If you think about it, all products or all surfaces across the globe are covered in microorganisms, and by putting your vegetables or your produce in cold storage, it reduces the reproductive ability of those microorganisms and slows them down. Vegetable safety is extremely important enough that it's regulated, depending on how much product you sell each year. The Food Safety Modernization Act, described by the USDA, took place or went into effect in 2016. It replaced, for the most part, the GAPS practices, or the Good Agricultural Practices training. And this Food Safety Modernization Act is a set of operational procedures that are put in place to reduce microbial contamination of fruits and vegetables. If you go out to sustainableagriculture.net/FSMA, you can read about what is entailed in this Food Safety Modernization Act and whether it applies to you or not. There are best practices training available that teach you whether you need to go through the full FSMA and if you have to do audits, and those trainings can be located through the University of Illinois Extension Office. And the goal of this whole Safety Act is to reduce foodborne illnesses. So why is this Food Safety Modernization Act so important? Well, if we think about it, how many times on the news do you hear about there's another E. coli contamination of lettuce, or some other food product is being recalled? Contaminated produce does cause illnesses. Of the illnesses it causes, about 1% of the affected people actually die, and 10% of affected people are hospitalized. There are other consequences when you hear about a food safety recall that are not often thought about immediately. People lose their jobs. If you are responsible, or a farm manager responsible for providing safe produce, and you have a contamination problem, you're going to lose your job. Farms actually lose income, and in some cases can even go bankrupt. There was a case several years ago with contaminated melons. There were two gentlemen who were running their farm. They had bought a salad washer, a secondhand salad washer, and it wasn't taken apart and sterilized properly, and they used it to wash their netted melons. And people that ate those melons, there were actually some deaths from the contamination of those melons. They were then later sued, and they've gone bankrupt and lost their farms. There are economic impacts to contaminated food, losses of up to $80 billion a year. Affected people are less productive. If you think about it, you go to a restaurant or you buy a product from the grocery store that's been contaminated and you get sick, you are not, if you do go to work, you're not going to be as productive. Affected vegetables also lose market share. We've had several instances where leafy greens have been recalled due to contamination, and they couldn't give the romaine away in the grocery stores not that long ago. Everybody was buying organic as well as trying to get romaine locally. And then people who do become sick from some type of food contamination have a tendency to sue for compensation. So that does cause some serious economic impacts. If you're trying to figure out which products have had outbreaks recently, you can go to the FDA.gov site and look up their safety recalls. Another one is the fsis.usda.gov website, and you can look up for current recalls and alerts. Any given time you go out to these websites, there are always alerts and recalls going on. A lot of times it's leafy greens, sometimes it's processed meats, but they do have a list of everything out there that's being recalled. So what is associated with these recalls and outbreaks? I mentioned leafy greens already. They are one of the biggest contributors to recalls. Melons and tomatoes. Between the three of them, they make up about 65% of the outbreaks that occur yearly. And they cause increase in illness. And the reason we're seeing these increase in illness is because many people are starting to eat more raw vegetables, trying to be healthy. If the consumer has a weak immune system or is older or they are immunodeficient, they tend to succumb to these diseases and outbreaks more quickly. And if you think about it, our food system has become extremely complex. We used to, many years ago, prior to the industrialization of our food production, our food basically came from our backyard, it came to the table and we ate it. Now the food system is extremely complex and food travels long distances. It's put on ships, it's put on planes, it's put on trains and on trucks. It comes from long distances, and the further away it comes from, the more opportunity there is for some type of contamination. The time that food spends in travel also reduces its quality. And if you think about it, you have a lot more people touching the food or handling the food because they have to load it onto these trucks or trains, and they have to unload it, and then they have to open the boxes up and package them. It's a lot of opportunity for something to go wrong. So what kind of contaminants are we seeing in our food system? The first type we're going to talk about is physical contaminants, and this is contamination by things like plastic or glass or metal, wood, bandages, jewelry, and other personal items. There's chemical contaminants. Many times you'll see the recalls, they're contaminated because a allergen wasn't labeled, so it may contain peanuts and that wasn't put on the label. Pesticides, there are many studies now being done about how much pesticide is being found in our food. Things like sanitizers, so when they clean their machines, they didn't get them rinsed thoroughly enough, and so the sanitizers, the residue is getting into our food. And again, with machines, they have to be taken apart and lubricated to keep them working properly. And if those lubricants aren't applied appropriately, they can get into our food as well. Biological contaminants are another source, and these are things like parasites, viruses, and bacteria. And if we look at the viruses, bacteria, and parasites, these contaminants typically come from things like animals, wild and domestic. Many times it comes in with fertilizer or manure. People are another source of contaminants. They go to work sick. They don't wash their hands after they use the restroom. And they are then introducing contaminants into that food system or into the food they're handling. And then another major concern of contaminants is water and the environment. Vegetables and products are grown out in open fields and they're irrigated, or we have rain that can pick up contaminants along the way and deposit those contaminants onto the growing produce. So if you want to sell your product from a small farm type situation, it's recommended you get this food safety training. You can go to the extension.illinois.edu and find out when trainings are available. Many times they have special trainings, especially in the winter time when farmers are not as busy. They try to work it around the schedule so that it makes it easier for food producers to go. You can also check the product or produce safety alliance.cornell.edu, and this will give you a list of all trainings through their program, and it includes trainings in foreign countries as well as the United States. The topics that they cover in this training are things such as human health and hygiene, stressing the washing of hands and not going to work sick, and if you are sick, what protective covering you have to wear, how to use soil amendments appropriately so that they don't contaminate your products. For example, if you're going to fertilize a field with manure, you have to have so many days after that manure application, it's actually closer to months, till you can harvest your first product out of there. They address water quality and pesticides, harvest and post-harvest handling, how to manage wildlife, and something that's very important, how to keep good records so that if you do have a contamination, it can be traced. You would then do a written food safety plan, as well as get third-party audits and certifications. And if you want to see what's in that FSMA training, there's an electronic manual out on the internet. You can go look at it and download it if needed. So human health and hygiene, this is one of the main ways to reduce any type of food safety issues. Fruits and vegetables, if we think about it, those are mainly harvested by people, and your workers or yourself need training and things like what the food safety risks are and proper hygiene and what equipment is used in harvesting and washing and packaging and transporting these vegetables. Soil amendments, manure, since it is coming from some type of livestock, typically can contain harmful microbes. And unfortunately, vegetables and fruit can get those microbes from the soil. If you apply manure and then plant directly into it, soil splash from rain or irrigation can cause those microbes to pop up onto the soil, or pop up from the soil onto your vegetables. So you need to be able to understand timing as far as manure applications go, and the grower needs to protect both crops and water from manure. You also need to compost manure properly to reduce any contamination risks. Water is probably one of the other big sources of contamination. It can carry many different types of pathogens, so it's important that you know your source of the water that you use for your crop production. Is it potable water that is provided by a city or a town water system, or are you pulling water from a pond? Drip irrigation also reduces risk of contamination since you're putting the water directly at the soil line instead of overhead watering where it actually touches your produce. And it's important that you maintain water safety. If you have a pond that you use for irrigation, fencing it to keep livestock away or wildlife away may be something you have to consider. And if you are using water to clean your produce during post-harvest handling, it typically has to have some type of disinfectant in it. Pesticide use, overuse of pesticide is one way that contaminants get into the food system. You want to make sure that if you are using any type of pesticides, whether it be herbicide or insecticide or a fungicide, that you read and follow the instructions on the label always. Period, no questions. Read and follow the labels. You want to make sure you're using it appropriately, in the appropriate concentrations at the appropriate time, that you're handling it appropriately, not using it on windy days or wearing the appropriate protective gear. You want to make sure you're storing it in the appropriate place. If it needs to be in a cool, dark location, that's where you're storing it. And if you're not using it any longer or you've finished your containers, that you're disposing of things appropriately. You need to make sure that you keep records on all pesticide use if you're growing for markets other than personal consumption. It's very important that you keep those records. Animal management is another issue you need to be aware of. Animals do carry pathogens, and not just wild animals but domestic animals as well. And you need to make sure that if you're selling for market that you exclude both wild and domestic animals as much as possible from your fields, definitely from your packing houses and your delivery vehicles. With harvest and post-harvest handling, if you're going to harvest the crop out of your field, you want to make sure you're using clean and sanitary equipment. So you would clean your harvest knives or your pruners or whatever tools you're using. You want to make sure you pick intact and undamaged produce. So if your tomato has a bite out of it, thanks to the chipmunks getting into your field, you're not picking that and putting it in with your other tomatoes. If you have damaged produce, many times farmers will just cut that off and leave it in the field, or will cut it off and put it in a separate box and remove it. You want to avoid picking any produce that is covered with or near fecal matter. So if you have wildlife that are getting into your fields, you want to avoid picking anything that's been contaminated. And you want to use deterrents to keep wildlife away. If the deer pressure is particularly heavy, you may have to think about fencing. Rabbits, of course, as we've seen in the farm, are an issue, so trying to keep them out of certain crops. Anything you can do to reduce those contaminants from getting in. Post-harvest handling. Once you've picked your produce, you're going to need to cool it quickly, typically. One of the ways to reduce field heat is to make sure you're picking early in the morning or on a cloudy day. Many times that's a nice goal to have, but in reality, if you're a farmer or a small scale farmer trying to get produce to market, you may just have to pick when you can, but you need to think about how you're going to cool it, either in a portable cooling container, like in a trailer, or putting it into shade, or taking it back to your storage facility where you can put it in the cooler. Many times when you're after picking or as you're picking, you can contaminate this product. If you're picking bins, the bins you're putting your produce in aren't clean, or if you're reusing wax boxes, if those aren't clean, it's something to make sure that you are trying to keep things as clean as possible. Training your workers so that they look at these packing boxes they're picking into and say, this one's not clean, I'm not using it. I finished picking a box and let me go put it in the cooler rather than leaving it set in the field till they finish picking the entire crop. These type of things are important to train for. And then keeping detailed records. Knowing when you picked a crop, how it was cooled, is very important in case there's ever any question of whether contamination came from your product or not. If you're going to run a U-pick operation for, say, strawberries or apples, it's important that you do have a good agricultural practices plan in place. You want to make sure you provide sanitation amenities, meaning you need public toilets as well as washing stations, someplace for them to wash their hands. And you want to make sure that that equipment is kept sanitary, not just the baskets that they're picking into, but the public facilities and washing stations as well. And one of the last things we're going to talk about in this safety lecture is to make sure you're keeping good records. I can't stress enough how important, if you are a small farmer or if you're selling produce to the public, that you keep good records. If for some reason there is a contamination outbreak, they can use these records to trace back the origin of the food item that's been contaminated. Our food system today is very complex, so you want to make sure that you document all activities when you're applying any pesticides, when you're irrigated or when you had your pond water tested, when you picked and when you packed and what temperatures your coolers are at. These are all covered in the trainings that you will go through, but it is important that you keep things documented. If for some reason contamination is tracked back to your facility, the fact that you have detailed records will indicate that you did what you could to protect your customers from contamination and shows due diligence, and that may become important if there are ever any liability issues. And record keeping is an excellent business tool. If you look back at your records, you can determine when you had to apply pesticides, when you had to apply irrigation, what was making you the best profit. So record keeping is not only good for liability issues, but also as a way to make sure you have a successful business. Once you start working with your food safety plan, depending on how much produce you're growing, you may or may not need to do an audit, but make sure your safety plan is updated regularly. It's a living document, meaning that you don't write it once and forget it. It's something that's updated on a regular basis. It demonstrates to the auditors that food safety risk is being controlled, and once you have your documentation in place, you can apply for these audits so that you can get permission to sell your produce without liability issues. And they do come out and audit your growing situation, but they're done during the growing season. They want to see how things are handled. They're not going to come during the off season. So be aware that you may have to schedule something for auditors. For some additional resources on food safety, you can go to the University of Illinois Extension's Small Farms website, and they will have information on training as well as whether or not you need to go through a food safety audit.